Scotland Yard report concluded that the so-called unemployed have the appearance of habitual loafers rather than unemployed workmen. The poor and distressed appearance of numbers of persons met in the East End is due more to thriftlessness and intemperate habits than to absolute poverty. Poverty is brought about by a want of thrift. This criminal class was made evil by something in their souls that bound them together into a plague of organised gangs stalking the dark alleys of the city. Another journalist, Henry Fielding, wrote of these organised gangs of hundreds using disguises and carrying out planned robberies. The reality looked more like this. In 1910, a 22-year-old found guilty of the theft of a bicycle pleaded, "My lord, I have never stolen anything unless driven to do so by hunger. I have not had anything to eat since 5:30 on Saturday night, until given something at the police station Monday morning. My lord, I do not want to thieve, I would sooner work, as it's much easier, but a man of my character is not able to get work. For God's sake, give me this chance." Another in the same year, after stealing iron from the roadside, said, "Please sir, we did not know it was wrong, and said there is a bit of food now for our wife. They had not food for 3 days. Think of them at home, sir. We was out at work for 8 weeks before we went out doing this. We are sorry now we took it, sir." To elites, though, the criminal class was a more appealing way to direct society's attention to a scourge that justified heavy-handed policing. The criminal class was ugly, deformed, animalistic even. Reporter Angus Reach went on a tour of the depths of the London criminal underworld with a police inspector and wrote that they were coarse-looking and repulsive, more than one with contused coloured faces. The men were of that class you often remark in low localities, squalid, hulking fellows with no particular mark of any trade or calling on them. He went on, "The light from a lamp fell upon his face, and I never saw a worse one. Little, deep-sunk eyes and square, bony jaws with a vile expression." The psychiatrist Henry Maudsley argued that teaching self-control to these criminals was as foolish as to preach moderation to the east wind or gentleness to the hurricane. The degeneracy theorists of the time argued that the English people were losing the Darwinian struggle and sinking into depravity. In 1844, Blackwood's magazine wrote that crime had soared by 700% and asked, "What is destined to be the ultimate fate of a country in which the progress of wickedness is much more rapid than the increase in the number of people?" An article in the Times declared that the criminal classes are more alien from the rest of the community and a hostile army, for they have no idea of joining the ranks of industrious labour, either here or elsewhere. The civilised world is simply the carcass on which they prey, and London, above all, is to them a place to sack. One 1890 book on contemporary science informed that by some accident of development, by some defect of heredity, or birth or training, the criminal belongs, as it were, to a lower and older social state than that in which he is actually living. Despite it being argued that society needed protection from murder and theft, court proceedings against degenerates, drunks, street offenders, vagrants, and brawlers made up 62% of all cases. But what the rational planners of modern society really wanted was more efficiency, more order, and less idleness. The primary and overriding object for which streets exist is passage, a judge ruled in 1913. There is no such thing as a right in the public to hold meetings as such in the streets. Streets are for passage, and passage is paramount to everything else.
Meanwhile, at the marketplace, some boxes have fallen off a moving lorry, fortunately without injuring any passers-by, and a crowd has quickly gathered round, thus blocking the traffic. It is one of the policeman's duties to see that roads and pavements are kept clear. A softly spoken, "Move along there, please," from the policeman is enough to send the people on their way. The policeman also has to make sure that the public obey the traffic laws. In this case, the driver, having given his particulars to the policeman, is told that in future he must take greater care in tying down the boxes which he carries on his lorry.
The position of the law through the police in the 19th century wasn't about the protection of property and person, but about the regulation of efficient order and the protection from radical change. The meetings of political radicals were kept under surveillance and often infiltrated by police spies. The term "move along" became popular. Traditional annual street fairs were shut down. Even people carrying boxes of goods were questioned. The fist of modernity was the outward extension of the muscular power of the capitalist state. The historian J.F. Stephen has written that the administration of criminal justice is the commonest, the most striking, and the most interesting shape in which the sovereign power of the state manifests itself to the great bulk of its subjects. To citizens, the peaceful British bobby standing on the street corner was still suggestive. While he didn't usually carry a gun, the potential for state violence was well assumed by the public. The Peterloo massacre in 1819 saw 12 people killed by the guns of the state. Similarly, during a Chartist demonstration in 1848, 170,000 armed special constables were mobilised by the government in London alone. Surveillance and detection were also central. The introduction of the criminal record system in 1869 improved with the use of photography and fingerprinting in 1902. In 1910, the police began to use motorised boats and cars instead of rowing boats and horse-drawn vehicles. Wireless communications were introduced in 1923. The fist was becoming technological, always one step ahead of the criminal class.
The telephone operator immediately asks which service the caller needs: fire, police, or ambulance. If police aid is needed, the call is switched straight through to the police information room. This room at police headquarters is manned day and night. From here, the duty officer can send wireless messages to the patrol car nearest the scene of the incident. The cars are so placed that it is seldom more than 2 or 3 minutes before the police are dealing with the problem on the spot. Apparently, a woman has seen someone moving about near the back of her neighbor's house, and as she knows that the owners are at the local cinema, she has rightly called for the police, realizing that it is her duty to do so.
And the fist continues to grow and swing. In 1962, it was estimated that almost 1 in 3 men were likely to be convicted of an offence across their lifetimes, and criminal justice is still likely to target an often illusory criminal class. Historian Stephen Box has written that still, our criminal justice system is a selective process in which the powerful are unlikely to be criminalised, whilst the powerless are more likely to end up behind the walls of crumbling, overcrowded Victorian prisons. The historian Douglas Hay has written that it was easy to claim equal justice for murderers of all classes, where a universal moral sanction was more likely to be found, or in political cases, the necessary price of a constitution ruled by law. The trick was to extend that communal sanction to a criminal law that was 9/10 concerned with upholding a radical division of property. Hay continues, the law allowed the rulers of England to make the courts a selective instrument of class justice, yet simultaneously to proclaim the law's incorruptible impartiality and absolute indeterminacy. And finally, the historian Vic Gatrell concludes that the history of crime is a grim subject, not because it's about crime, but because it's about power.
And so the tour of duty goes on throughout the city. Night and day, in rain, in snow or sunshine, the policemen are out on their beats, friendly and helpful, being firm where firmness is called for, and being kind to those who seek aid. The policeman is a friend of the people, and he knows that they will always turn to him without fear or restraint in their time of need. Move along.